Hey everyone, Steve Weintraub with Collider. I am overjoyed to have Damon Lindelof in studio today to talk about Watchmen. Before you even say a word, I want to say on camera, HBO has blessed me by letting me see the first 6 episodes of this show. It is incredible. I can't believe what you did with the material, and it's really, in this age of amazing television, this show stands near the top. It's just so well done. So anyone who's watching this, who has any debate about watching this show, you need to watch.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
I needed to start with that.
Thank you.
I want to jump backwards, and I want to talk about how did you first meet with HBO to discuss making this show? Was it one of these things where you heard they were thinking about it, or you went in and said something?
I've had a love affair with Watchmen since I first read it. I was 13 years old, and have talked about it sort of incessantly since I've been blessed enough to move into the pop culture sphere. So in between the first and the second seasons of Lost, I was getting asked questions like, "Oh my God, you're doing nonlinear storytelling, and you do flashbacks, and there'll be every episode is a different character." And I would say I learned that all from Watchmen. I mean, just so we're all clear, I stole it from Watchmen, and Watchmen is the greatest piece of popular culture ever created. And one of the most exciting things to come out of Lost was that quote, me saying that Watchmen was the greatest piece of popular culture ever created, got blurbed on the back of one of the Watchmen trades. And I was just like, oh my God, my name is on the back of a Watchmen trade. And what a thrill that was. So word sort of got out that I was a huge fan of this thing because I was talking about it incessantly. And so when Zack Snyder made his movie, I got pulled into one of these early screenings where Billy Crudup is covered in all sorts of like ping pong balls and mocaps, as sort of like the Watchmen literate. And so over time, basically, I think probably the first time that it happened was around 2011. I had an overall deal with Warner Brothers, and someone over there approached me and said, hey, would you want to do Watchmen as a television show? And my feeling at that point was Zach had just made the movie. The Watchmen is considered unadaptable and unfilmable. Alan Moore, who I should say is a genius, and I'm only sitting here because of him, not just because of Watchmen, but I learned so much writing. He does not want you to watch Watchmen. So if you are a Moore acolyte, please honor his wishes. That said, I was sort of like, Alan Moore doesn't want anybody to do it. Pass. Like, it shouldn't exist. And then a couple of years later, again from Warner Brothers, and obviously they have all this DC IP, sort of came back and said, hey, what about Watchmen? Like, you said no a couple years ago. Have you thought any more about it? And I said, I have, and still no. And then as The Leftovers was ending, this time, Warner Brothers, sort of with HBO, they've been under the same corporate umbrella for quite some time, but they'd obviously been talking to one another now. As The Leftovers was ending, I again sort of fielded the inquiry of, like, okay, are you sure you don't want to do anything with Watchmen? And now the sort of parentheses was, we're going to move on. Like, we're going to start asking other people to do this. And at that point, I started realizing this thing is going to happen whether I do it or not. And I know that it's a moral justification to say, well, I'm a vegan, but that steak is already there. The animal's already dead. So if I don't eat it, it's just going to rot. That's BS. Like, but I started to feel the professional jealousy of what was it going to be like for me to see someone else's Watchmen, knowing that I had a shot at it and I didn't take it. And then also I started to feel like I had the beginnings of what the ideas might be to go into this Watchmen. And so the third time that they asked me, I said, let me go give it a think. And then kind of here we are 2 years later, and it exists.
I am so thankful that you decided to say yes. I think everyone watching as they watch the series will be saying the exact same thing.
We shall see. But,
I'm very confident on this one.
Okay.
So you started having those ideas. You started thinking about it. Did it always walk down the path that the series ended up on, or did you have radical other ideas that almost came to fruition?
I think the central ideas are in the series. I think that the idea of what happens when masking sort of spreads to policing, that was a big part of it. The idea of how we feel in America about policing right now, and the institution of the law and authority all felt very timely, but it also felt like a very natural progression from the central ideas of the original Watchmen, which were, who watches the Watchmen? I think that a lot of people who are not really familiar with the with the original 12 issues, or they'll call it the graphic novel, although that name, that designation came later. One of the questions that it was asking is, what is the line between the law and vigilantism? When is it okay to go above and beyond the law? And so I felt like that was a central tenet of Watchmen. And now the 2019 that I was living in was constantly questioning and doubting the intention and ability of police, and more importantly, the government that was responsible for policing the police. And so all of those ideas felt just as relevant now as they did in the mid 80s, but it felt like there was an evolution to be had there. And so that central idea, thematically really took hold. And then the other was that just sort of all around me was the feeling of like there was a reckoning happening in the country as it related to race. This idea of that there is a history of the United States that was taught to me as a sort of middle class, a borderline privileged kid living in northern New Jersey in this incredibly sort of diversified community, but utopic to some degree, and then the actual United States history that is like, as I'm starting to read more, I always knew that slavery happened. Duh, there's Black History Month, you get that month, but then everything else is kind of hidden. And as I started most specifically reading what Ta-Nehisi Coates was writing, and I just have to, full disclosure, I have to say that I started reading Ta-Nehisi Coates because that's what white liberals in Los Angeles are supposed to do. And when we have our woke-offs, when we're, it's all about what podcasts we're listening to and who's read the most Ta-Nehisi Coates. So I kind of went to church with the intention of saying, hey, I went to church today, but in this case, when I read The Case for Reparations, which was an essay of his in the Atlantic, that was the sermon that I heard that suddenly changed my entire perspective on the way that I saw the world. And in that essay, he mentioned Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, and I felt ashamed and embarrassed that I had never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. I had somehow considered myself an educated person who was somewhat of a history buff, interested in the history of race in the past century and beyond, and yet I didn't know what Black Wall Street was. So I bought a book called The Burning that tells the detailed story of that, and I was reading that book at the time that this Watchmen invitation happened. And so all of those things were starting to swirl around in my brain, and they started to feel like they might combine into a television experience.
It's crazy how that all came together, because the things you're talking about are so important to the series and are handled really powerfully. Man, there's so much I want to talk about. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. So I'm going to switch completely and say, what did you learn making The Leftovers that you could apply to making Watchmen?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess sort of like the short answer is that the bandwidth for a show, the frequency of tone, requires a certain degree of experimentation. And there's something to be said for, I got very locked in on what I thought The Leftovers was. So I read Tom Perrotta's book, and I was like, this is about grief and loss and despair, existential despair from which there is no escape. And it's just that. And I was really interested in telling that story because that was an emotion that I wasn't really seeing a lot on TV. And I think it resulted in the first season of The Leftovers, which was all of those adjectives that I just mentioned. And even people who liked it would say to me, like, I really liked the first season of The Leftovers, but it kind of made me ill. And I was like, thanks. And as we moved into the second and third season of the show, and particularly because the writer's room, I started listening a lot more to what other people had to say about what they saw when they read The Leftovers, or even what they saw when they saw the first season of the show. And they said, we think that there's a lot of space for absurdity, and we think that there's more space for genre, borderline sci-fi storytelling. And I was like, no, the sudden departure is the only weird thing that happened. And they're like, but the perception of what could be weird and the mistaking of miracles feels like there's space there too. And so I suddenly realized, like, The Leftovers, can it be funny? Can it be absurd? Let's try. And so coming into Watchmen, I feel what I learned is that not to get locked in on what I feel the very specific, there's only one frequency we can tune into here. There's actually a lot more bandwidth, and more importantly, to listen more. And I feel like that's really hard. It's easy for me to say, like, I listened to the other writers. That's always my intention, but it's hard when someone else is talking to say to your own brain, shut up. You're just waiting to say the next thing that you want to say. You're not really listening. You're not really creating a space for their idea to flourish. You just want their idea to support whatever your next idea is. And I went through that process on The Leftovers, and I think as a result, the second and third season of The Leftovers became this incredible thing that didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like ours. And I really feel that way about Watchmen too. That happened very quickly, but it stopped being mine pretty quickly, started becoming ours, because we obviously all had different relationships with the source material, and we're finding the new thing together. But I do think that was a really valuable lesson that I brought into Watchmen.
Did you, when you started coming up with the idea and you're figuring it all out, were you thinking at all about budget in the creative process, knowing with all your experience what things cost, and how much were you sort of like, I'm just going to write it and then I'll think about the budget?
Both. I mean, I think that we certainly had ideas after having done Lost first and then The Leftovers. Obviously there was a shift in scope. So Lost, even though it was on broadcast television, they gave us a tremendous budget, one that I was really grateful for the entire time we were making that show, that was very far above and beyond a traditional broadcast budget. And then when we did The Leftovers, obviously it was an HBO show, but I think everybody understood that this was kind of more of an artisanal pizza. And so the idea that it was never going to attract a very wide, large audience, it just wasn't scaled that way. The budget had to be reflective of that. But at the same time, we wanted to be ambitious, but we were constantly having budget battles. With Watchmen, nobody said to me, we're going to write you a blank check. But in our early conversations about what the scope of the show was going to be, and as I said to HBO, just know that this is a century show. As the original Watchmen took place in the range between the late 1930s and the mid 1980s, this show is going to start in 1921, and it's going to take us all the way to 2019. And it might not necessarily all take place on the planet Earth. So I just want you guys to know going in that the appetite and the ambition and the scope is more Lost than it is Leftovers. And HBO was like, we totally get that. And conversations about what the actual dollar amount would be didn't really come into play until they got the pilot script and we budgeted it out, and then they started to realize, okay, when he said that the ambition was high, wow, it's really high. But I will say in their defense, and again, not in their defense because they don't require defending, but when we would ask for things like Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, for example, is like, these are movie composers, these are A-list composers. They've never done TV before. It's gonna cost to get these guys. There were no there were no money conversations. As soon as they heard that Trent and Atticus may be interested, it was like, let's go get them.
And by the way, I have to say, their music in this is
extraordinary.
It's a character.
1,000%.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually, what happened was they were like, which composers might you be interested in for this? And from project to project, I always like to change composers because it forces me to be a little bit outside my comfort zone. So even though Michael Giacchino is a genius, it didn't feel like he should do Leftovers. And even though Max Richter is a genius, it didn't feel like he should do Watchmen. And so HBO was like, who are you thinking? And I was like, well, Trent and Atticus, they don't do TV, but this show feels to me like it sounds like them. And then there was like an awkward pause on the other end of the phone, and I was like, oh, they don't agree with me. And Francesca Orsi, the exec at HBO, said, that is so weird because their manager called me 2 hours ago and said, what's going on with Watchmen? And I was like, get me in a room with those guys. Right. So I sat down with Trent and Atticus and try not to, I get starstruck, but they're rock stars and they're super duper cool. And like normally like you can't geek out too hard. And I was like, we have to get this out of the way. I just worship and adore everything that you've ever done, and you're amazing. And then we all started kind of talking about Watchmen, the original, and what it meant to them. And by the end of that meeting, I was like, this is going to be incredible. And about a month later, I just got a huge file of music that Trent and Atticus had done and said, hey, look, we know that you haven't, you've just written the pilot and you haven't shot it yet, but when we read it, this is kind of what we were thinking. And I'd say like 90% of the music in the pilot was in that first piece of material before we'd even shot it. And so Nicole Cassell and I, we would listen to it on the set, and it informed the actual shooting of the show. The music came first, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the music is so good.
They're super amazing.
I'm curious. So you get in the writers' room, you put together this staff. How many scripts did you have before? How many scripts did you have before the shooting began? You had the pilot, and then.
Right. So we actually put the writers' room together, about a dozen writers, before the pilot was written, just to do the world building, because we knew that everything in the original Watchmen was canon, so we were kind of covered through 86, late 85, and that we needed to build a new history between December of 85 and basically September of 2019, which is the front story, the present time for our Watchmen, in addition to carving out spaces in the pre-existing history of the previous Watchmen, because our story actually starts in 1921 in Oklahoma. And so we had to do a lot of work over the course of that time period. And in that time period, we also broke the pilot episode. And then I went off and wrote that. We hiatused the writer's room. We shot the pilot. And then HBO watched the pilot and said, okay, we're gonna go ahead and order the series. And then we reconvened the writers.
I have to ask you, did you ever think after making the pilot that they were gonna turn it down?
Constantly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh yeah, constantly. I mean, I have a very complicated relationship with the work, and we're having this conversation right now 3 days before it is shown on HBO, and I still am like, does it work? Like, my own feelings about the show, there are parts of it that I'm immensely proud of, but those are the parts that feel like the least mine. It's constantly, like, I have a very complicated relationship with it. So while I feel like Nikki did an incredible job directing it, and the cast did an incredible job acting in it, and the costumes were cool, and the music sounded awesome, and it was shot beautifully, and the production design was impeccable, and everybody brought their A game, I was sort of like, I don't know if this works. And that's not me being modest or being a pessimist. It's just the way that I felt. So when HBO called and said, like, oh my God, we're into this, I was like immensely relieved and surprised, and also sort of like, oh my God, we've got to make more. Like, fortunately, we had a plan.
Sure.
Because a lot of the work that we did over the course of that first writer's room, we had said this is what the season would be. Not the first season, the season, because one of the things that I think makes the original Watchmen endure is that it was a complete story, beginning, middle, and end over the course of those 12 issues. And when I finished reading the 12th issue, of course I wanted more, because I loved it so much, but I also felt like a sense of completedness, and I want the audience to have the same sense watching these 9 episodes. So to answer your question, we dove back into the writing, and we had basically an episodic plan for what episodes 2 through 9 would be. And the first thing, I don't know where we are in spoiler territory, but I can't say.
Right now we're spoiler free, essentially.
Okay. Well, I can say this, and this is spoiler free, which is that Jeremy Irons is sort of kind of in his own show inside of the show of Watchmen. Now they're on parallel tracks, and eventually those tracks will come smashing into one another. I promise that. But we shot all of Jeremy's work in Wales, and it needed to be completed before the weather turned. And so the first thing that we all wrote as writers were 9 episodes worth of material for Jeremy Irons. So we had to have a real plan in motion for how that would weave in with the other story, because we wrote all that and we shot that first up. And so before we wrote episode 2, we wrote all of Jeremy's work, episodes 2 through 9.
That's crazy. And his stuff is, what I've seen of his stuff is so good.
He's off the charts.
Like, it's so good.
Yeah, what he's doing is it's amazing.
So you basically knew where you were going the whole time, where like the final shot was going to go, or where the ending of this story would go.
Yeah. I mean, getting there, getting to the destination, getting to what the last episode's going to be. A big part of the original Watchmen and the way that I like to tell stories and watch stories is what's the pace at which you answer questions and resolve mysteries. And again, that's an imperfect science. I've learned over time that it's not an exact science. But so we knew the answers to a lot of the questions that the show is asking, but are we going to answer them in episode 6? Are we going to answer them in episode 8? Maybe we do this one in episode 7. But to answer your question, there's some stuff that could only happen in the finale. So I think that we knew more about how the season was going to end than we did about some of the things that were happening in the range of episodes, sort of like 5 through 8.
Completely. You've said one of the things that I love about what I've seen so far and what you just said is that this show does have a beginning, middle, and an end. But I'm telling you, as someone who has seen the first 6 episodes and knows what I've watched and the quality of the writing and the quality of the production design, the music, everything, I have a feeling that you're going to stick the landing, and I have a feeling that fans of this material and of this show, who maybe have not read the comic book, are absolutely going to hope that you have more or another story that you might want to tell in this world. Is it something that you can't even process in terms of, do I want to touch the third rail one more time? Or is it something, do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean, and it's something that I'm, really thinking about for the first time in any real way, because this week that you and I are talking is like really the first week that I'm kind of finished with the work. We're still doing a lot of sound work and a lot of vis effects work to finish up the final couple episodes, but I'm more or less finished. And so, but more importantly, I'm in, now that the show is about to come out and I'm doing press for the show, people are asking, okay, so what's season 2 going to be? Because that's the way that we're programmed. I mean, that makes complete and utter sense to me. And for me, it's sort of like I have to anticipate the question, but I really wasn't thinking about season 2 as I was making season 1. So it's basically like every good idea that we have that's worthwhile is going into this season, and I don't want it to feel like we'll pay that off later, or like, oh, don't worry about that one. Like every story we're telling, let's pack it into these 9 episodes. And so my feeling is like obviously Watchmen is not mine. That's what's beautiful about it. And someone else can take the reins in the way that for comic book fans, of which I consider myself one first and foremost, the idea that Alan Moore himself came to Swamp Thing in the early 1980s, and he basically completely and totally reinvented that character, but that character was not his creation. And then someone like Brian Vaughan could come to Swamp Thing later, or Jeff Lemire, and do their own spin on the character. That's what Watchmen should be. So I'm not entirely sure that I should do another season, because kind of what keeps it fresh is that it's sort of a new vision. If I had the right idea, I'd certainly be open to it, but I haven't had that idea yet. And you talk about sticking the landing. That's yet to be determined. My hope is that at the very least, people will be like, it was really awesome watching that dive, even if he belly flopped.
Listen, I have a funny, you can't have such the first 6 episodes are so good that I have a lot of faith in you guys that you are going to stick it. But I mean, the thing about it is, though, I hear what you're saying, but I also think that if the ratings are very strong and the reaction is very strong, and thus far everything I've seen has been very strong, I would imagine HBO is going to say, well, we want to do another story.
Sure.
Look, I mean, I agree with you. I think that unless you have the right take on it, it's like, you know, don't ruin something awesome.
Right.
You know what I mean? But I think a lot of people are going to really hope you have something more after this, if you know, but who knows? Maybe it needs to stand on its own.
Yeah, and I think that I agree with you, but I feel like everything, particularly in this world that's very franchise heavy, very sequel heavy, it's all about pre-existing IP, et cetera, and I get that. I consume all that stuff and I love it, and I think that there's this really exciting space now for original storytelling, you know, inside of the world of pre-existing IP. That said, we should always start with the question, should we? You know, should we do this? Let's not just do this because we can get a lot of people to buy a ticket or to tune in because they have a pre-existing relationship with Watchmen or the Joker or Iron Man or Black Panther. Like, we should be asking ourselves, should we? You know, should we tell this story? And then if your answer to that is yes, then the follow-up question is be like, why? You know? And you should be able to answer that question too. And if you can't answer it, then don't do it.
I'm always wondering, I won't bring, but I look at Joker, like a nice one-off. But do you ever think Dark Knight Returns will ever get adapted? You know what I mean?
As a movie?
Or like an 8-episode HBO show. You know, the Frank Miller.
I mean, I would watch the hell out of it. And
sure. Any interest in that?
No, because the reason that I don't have any interest in it is because that would be a straight up adaptation, right? Where you're basically taking something that Frank Miller already wrote and illustrated and is perfect, and you're bringing it to life. And obviously Superman's going to be in it, and if you're literally doing Dark Knight straight up, but all you're basically doing is adapting something. And what made Dark Knight so amazing and revolutionary was that it was so original and groundbreaking. And so when it's just about, you can sort of, it's like the dance instruction where the painted feet are there on the ground and you just have to hit the right steps. I would just be terrified of messing it up, and more importantly, like, I want to freestyle. I'm not the guy for that, but I want it to exist and I would watch it.
I'm wondering just at what point that actually happens, because I agree with you, it's so original, so brilliant, it came out so close to Watchmen.
Right.
It's very weird that both of those things came out so close together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really interesting to wait for somebody like, you know, Michael Keaton, who has already done Batman, or Christian Bale 25 years from now, and then do Dark Knight with them. So it's someone who we actually saw play a younger version of Batman. That would be rad.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
How long did you have a lot of deleted scenes on the show, on Watchmen? Do you have a much longer first cuts, or is it pretty much what you shot is what's on screen?
The first cuts are always way too long because we overwrite the show and overshoot the show, but it's but like in the honing down and the tightening of the episodes, that's part of the process. I think, you know, in the pilot, there's only one deleted scene, which is actually like sort of the header of a scene that ended up in the show. So there's nothing that we shot that didn't air in some form, but you're always sort of like, that line of dialogue is completely and totally unnecessary. Don't need it. I'd rather stay here than get too cutty. So you find the rhythm of the show as you edit. But I think that universally speaking, the tighter it gets, the better it gets.
Sure. So for the whole 9 episodes, would you consider that there's like any deleted scenes that ended up not making it that are like worth people seeing, or not really?
There has to be one or two. I just literally can't think of any of them.
Sure.
I mean, like, we were pretty, you know, back to your earlier conversation about budget, and schedule. When you have a show this ambitious, I think to me the worst thing that you can do is make the crew go through the exercise of going out to some location for a day and 300 people and actors and cinematographers and directors are working to basically execute the scene to the best of their professional ability, and then it doesn't air. So you want to make sure at the scripting phase that everything feels absolutely and totally essential. And so as we start boarding the show, how are we going to schedule this thing and fit it inside 12 or 13 days of principal photography? That's when you have to have the first conversation of what is essential and what is non-essential. And that's when I think the cutting happens. That's when the deleted scenes occur. Like I have to get back to you. I'm really hard pressed to think of anything that we shot that is not going to air.
When did you have to have heard by now from who did you show the pilot to or any early episodes for honest feedback, or did you not do any of that in terms of just getting a feel from maybe people that had read the comic or not read the comic and watching it just to tell you? Because it's not like making a movie where you can do these big test screenings.
Right.
How did that work?
I mean, outside the immediate sort of Warner Brothers, HBO family, I was really reluctant to show the show to anyone because by time the pilot was mixed and finaled, we were already kind of shooting episode 8, and I was like, if we show it to people and they hate it, what are we gonna do? It's almost I don't want to. I sometimes get frustrated by the idea of people who want to show you their stuff and they just want the stamp. They just want to be told that it's great. They actually don't want the notes. And I was like, I don't know what I would be able to do with the notes at this point. So I probably should have done what you're describing, but I think that there was a huge level of fear of oh my God, what if someone watches this thing and says that it's just sort of morally reprehensible on every level.
Sure.
So I will say that that Ed Brubaker, who is a friend and colleague whose work I tremendously admire, and is someone who has an encyclopedic knowledge of Watchmen and is a huge sort of Alan Moore fan and believes very strongly in everything that Alan has said about Watchmen. I was like, I kind of feel like I want Ed to see it, not to give me the stamp, but if someone's going to say to me, this is an abomination, and you just need to know. You just need to prepare yourself for what the fans are going to say, what the Watchmen fans are going to say. I knew that he would be honest with me, so I showed him the pilot, and he was like, "You are." I'm paraphrasing. You are in way over your head here, but I think I kind of love it. And so I was like, "Okay, cool. I'll take that. That's a fair assessment."
Did you ever think about doing more than 9 episodes, or did you come close to 10 or 12?
The original plan was to do 10, and as we started plotting out the episodes, it started to feel like we were getting into that territory where one of them was going to be filler. It was so clear to me that the pacing wanted to be very explosive in the pilot. We wanted to stop and kind of recalibrate in episodes 2 and 3, and then episodes 4, 5, 6, very specific ramp into kind of a white knuckle 7, 8, 9. But as I started to feel when the 10th episode was the finale, and I started looking at the roadmap that we were going to take to get there, I was like, it feels like we're kind of driving 40 miles an hour here in these mid-range of episodes. What if we just pull this one out and we do 9? Then everything really started to click. So we ended up with this. I'm sort of really curious about this idea of how many episodes is a season of television now? What's the perfect number? What's just right? And the answer is it's completely and totally arbitrary. We did 25 hours of Lost in the first season, and 17 in the final season, and the experience of making those seasons of television was based on we'll be able to keep the quality bar high with the less episodes that we make. And then as we went into leftovers, we did 10, 10, and 8. And people were like, why aren't you doing 10 episodes in the final season? And I was like, because 8 felt like the right number.
Yeah, but people might forget, though, that with Lost, it was very early on that you guys were fighting ABC to try to get less episodes.
Right.
And
an end date, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people a lot of people don't realize that, because I think that you had it. You knew, I have so much story to tell, and I don't need 25 episodes a year to tell it.
Right.
Seriously, congratulations on the show. Thank you so much for coming
Appreciate
in.
it, man.
I really hope everyone watching this right now tunes in. It's what I've seen so far is brilliant.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. And I hope you like where it ends up.
I'm confident.